Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Welcome to the studio. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Pier-Philippe Chevigny. I'm a writer-director from Montreal, Quebec, and I directed a film called Richelieu and a few short films. All of my films are based on social issues, including migrant rights.
Your most recent film is the first full-length film, is that correct?
First feature film, correct. Richelieu.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That must have been an intense period of work, like to go from shorts to what you described as like 10 years of work into this film.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like the way movies are made in Canada and in Quebec. It just takes a very, very long time because we get, the funding comes from the government and you have to kind of get a place in line and wait for your turn. And sometimes it can be years and years and years. And it just takes a long time, to write a script in the first place. So you add all of those periods of development and waiting for the money, and it takes about 10 years, yeah.
That must be difficult to have such a long creative process for something that's so political, because our political times can shift. I mean, not major shifts, but do you find yourself having to update it as you go?
I used to update everything, and then at some point I just gave up on it. And to be honest, for Richelieu, which is about the temporary foreign workers program in Canada, not a lot has changed. But at some point I kept telling myself, if, at some point down the road, the program is, cut short or reformed, maybe some of this is not going to be relevant anymore. And my thinking was just, let's make it like a snapshot of what it was at this moment in time. Because if you keep rewriting all the time and then your story doesn't work anymore, you just never get anywhere. So that was kind of my thinking.
And in the end, it's perfectly timely. And in hindsight, there probably wasn't many changes to make.
Increasingly relevant, especially post-COVID. These stories happen all the time.
Well, I wouldn't say we're post-COVID, but, post-lockdown and the different rules that we had around migrant workers when we were pretending to act on COVID. But let's get into the film a little bit, because you mentioned that it touches on temporary foreign workers. Do you want to give the audience a bit of a synopsis to the film?
Yeah, so it takes place in Quebec, in the Richelieu Valley, which is about 40 kilometers south of Montreal. It's a very agriculture-centered region, lots of temporary foreign workers there. And we follow Ariane, who's a French to Spanish translator. She's hired in a food processing plant, basically. And she acts as the translator between the factory the bosses and the temporary foreign workers from Guatemala. And she will realize that they're being exploited in some way, and she starts taking the defense against the bosses' sometimes excessive orders.
For folks, this is a really predominant issue in Quebec. We've talked about it mostly from an Ontario perspective here on the show, where we interviewed Justice for Migrant Workers. We've done a few episodes around it and some of the changes that have been made. But in Quebec, as I'm doing kind of some research before coming on here, the numbers there have just shot up, in particular over the last 3 or 4 years. The Quebec government made a deal with the feds there to allow even more. And in the industry that you're talking about, that's one of the top employers of temporary foreign workers, or top exploiters because of the amount of complaints that come from that sector as well, have gone up tenfold. So this is a huge issue in Quebec and has been for some time.
Yeah, you might know the numbers better than me, but I think last year was about 65,000 foreign workers in Quebec only. And just before the pandemic, I think it was around 25, 30. So it has doubled in the 3 years. And yes, from what I've been told since the film has come out, people who watch the film, and a lot of either activists or temporary foreign workers themselves have seen the film, and what they say is basically this still happens, every day, basically.
And you must have known that because, like, as part of your research, did you work with migrant workers? Did you?
So yeah, the whole story it's kind of a long story. I started working on this back in 2013. I actually had done a short called Tala, which was also on the temporary foreign workers program, but through the eyes of a Filipino housemaid. Because the Philippines also has, a diplomatic relationship with Canada, and a lot of foreign workers from the Philippines come every year. And when I did that short, as part of the research process, I had found a lot of stuff about the agricultural sector as well. And, back in 2013, it really wasn't talked about that much in the media. The only people who said there were problems of exploitation were activists and unions, basically. And I had read documentations from activists that said, this is basically, a form of modern slavery. And I thought that sounded really, over the top. And my initial intention was to go out and make a documentary and kind of verify whether those allegations were true or not. Because I actually come from, the Richelieu Valley, which is very agricultural based, and there are, workers. So my thoughts were like, these guys that I used to see when I was a kid, are they really exploited? Is it really a form of modern day slavery? And nobody was talking about it. There were no documentaries, or very few back then. No feature film had been made on that issue. And so I went back home and started talking to people. And then I realized why there were no films, because the people who, are suffering from forms of exploitation, they don't want to speak out. They're too afraid of losing their jobs. And so at that point, making a documentary wasn't really a possibility because nobody would want to speak to me. So that's when the film became narrative feature, because through fiction, I could tell the truth, but I could also protect the anonymity of people who were talking to me. And it also allowed me to show exploitation as it happened, and not, if it was a documentary, it would have been based on hearing people, tell their stories. Through fiction, I could actually show it and have the audience experience it, make them feel like they're living it with the characters. And so what we did is we were referred to about 10 workers who claimed to have been victims of exploitation. And we actually went to Guatemala because when they were in Quebec, first of all, they were working all the time. They didn't have time to sit down and have a chat with me. And second of all, they didn't want to be, seen by the employers talking to someone who could be a journalist or whatever. So going to Guatemala was kind of a safe space for them. And we basically couch surfed around the country, going to several workers' houses. I was actually accompanied by Ariane Castellanos, who's the lead actress in the film. She was involved also in the whole research process. She kind of acted as my translator because my Spanish is very, very bad.
That's her role in the movie, right? She plays
exactly.
translator between.
She's a translator in the film, so
yeah.
And so, we basically, they were all very eager to speak, but they were afraid to be that their identity would be revealed. So we made sure to write a script based on their testimony, but, to change enough elements so that it couldn't be identified. And basically, the script is a collage of all the stories we were told. Nothing is pure fiction. Everything that happened to someone at some point in time. Maybe not in that order, maybe not to some things happen to another character, but everything is true.
Just to give a little bit of context to the audience too about why there might be fear. I mean, we've talked about it before, but temporary foreign workers are tied to a specific employer. They are not able to change to a different employer. If they lose their job, they have to go back to their home country.
Exactly. I was told actually there are workarounds. Like in the past few years, some stuff has changed, and now it's possible, but it's very, very complicated to change employers. But technically, their visa is specifically linked to the employer. At the moment they lose their jobs, their visa has expired and they have to leave the country. And in some of these cases, you're a peasant from Guatemala, you live in a country that has problems of corruption. Recruitment is done by private agencies. Oftentimes you have to pay money to get on the program. So before you even get to Canada, you're already indebted, and you have to pay that money back before going home. So if you lose your job and you go home, you have just debt. And sometimes it takes a few years for people to pay back their debt, and so it becomes profitable over years. So losing their job is just not an option. And so my film tells the story of bad employers. There are some situations, of course, it's not like that everywhere. There are employers who take care of their employees and they don't use blackmail to get around, but some do. And that's what my film show. And in those situations, if a boss says this week you have to work overtime every night, you cannot say no, otherwise you're going home. Well, they will work overtime every single night of that week. And that happens a lot. And also, they don't know their rights. That's one of the things. They are often uneducated peasants from Guatemala. They don't even know their rights in their country. Now, you take them out to Canada, they have no idea. They don't speak either language. They don't speak English. They don't speak French. And they don't know what their rights are in that country. So, of course, they're going to be very easily manipulated. And that's what happens.
And the sad thing is they don't have a lot of rights here. Although that's an important part of organizing around migrant rights, however, we find that they don't fall under the Labor Act. They are mostly beholden to having either a good employer or a bad employer. It's really luck. And one of the major threats that's always hanging over folks is that they're easily replaceable. Because as you can imagine, in the countries that they're recruiting these folks, there is an endless supply of people who are underemployed or not employed. And so, yes, this becomes systemic. One of the issues tackled in the film is also the lack of access to healthcare, or what happens when migrant workers get sick while they're here. We've told people before, but in case you haven't caught the episodes, they pay taxes. These people are part of work permits. Not everyone's working under the table. And that does not guarantee them, that does not provide them with access to our public healthcare system.
So actually what happens in that situation, technically they are eligible to what we have in Quebec is called RAMQ, le Régime d'assurance maladie du Québec. Technically, they are eligible to it, but it's the employer's responsibility to register the workers. And oftentimes, first of all, the employers don't even know they have to do that, or they won't do it because it's too much work. It's paperwork and stuff like that. And in the case that I researched for the film, that's exactly what happens. The employer just hadn't registered the workers, and so the worker ends up with no coverage at all, and he has to pay for, out of his pocket. And sometimes if you get sick or if you go to hospitals for a long time, it can end up being thousands and thousands of dollars, dozens of thousands of dollars, which is what happens in the film. And these people, they're already in debt before they even came here, and now they have $40,000 or $50,000 debt to add on top. They're never going to be able to pay that back. That makes no sense.
I want to ask you about the role of the protagonist in your film, in how it relates to mounting a resistance. We talk a lot about that, and agency as well. So at first glance, I get concerned because somebody comes in and kind of seemingly begins that resistance for them. But then I realize she herself faces economic exploitation, layers of it, and is herself being a worker kind of leveraged against other workers. But if you want to maybe talk about that a little bit and why it was necessary to have a character come in and spark that fight back as opposed to the workers who were experiencing that day in and day out.
So the starting point was my research once again, because like I met an actual translator who did stuff like that, who like sacrificed their own job to protect the workers. And that was kind of the starting point for the story, because I had researched, you know, the subject, but I didn't know what the story was going to be. And when I met that person, I knew like this is a strong story in itself. And the truth is, once again, and it's not like to come back with stereotypes or anything, but a lot of these workers are truly uneducated. They wouldn't know, where to go, who to ask help with. They're truly defenseless. They're truly voiceless. It's not, in the very, very concrete way, they cannot sometimes defend themselves. They don't even speak the languages. They need help for real. And also, there were, dozens and dozens of migrant workers, film stories that were told in the last, the last years. I've seen a lot, but I never seen it through the perspective of someone who's a translator. And also, like, of course, when I write a film, I think about, the political issues, but I also think in terms of storytelling and what's going to be a different story that hasn't been told before and all that stuff. So that to me felt exciting and new. I hadn't seen that before, seeing someone who's a translator. And also that was interesting to me because the translator inside the factory is the only person who has access to both the worker side and also the manager sides. So it allows the viewer to see kind of both sides of the equation and to be able to paint a portrait that's much more nuanced, because it's not like anyone's guilty. Specifically, it's kind of the whole system that's a problem. The whole system pits everyone, against each other. Everyone is both, in some ways complicit and in some ways a victim of the system. Even the boss himself, we see him, we see the pressure he faces, he feels from the higher ups above him. And it's it's not about like saying this. There's one individual who's the culprit. It's the whole system, which is the problem. And it's a chain of exploitation, and everyone, including Ariane, including the workers themselves, because at some point we see that they also exploit each other, are put in that situation because the system, forces individuals to act like that.
And at the same time, when fully exposed to that same system, some people will behave differently.
Yeah, at some point, that's what happens in the film. Once Ariane realizes that she's a part of that system, she decides to, split with it. She decides to try to put an end to it. And that's why she begins to disobey her boss and rebel against his orders.
Very similar theme to your film, Rebel, where, again, I've read interviews where you're talking about the work on that film, and your intention specifically is not to demonize the easily demonizable. Okay, so for folks that maybe haven't seen, this is a short film that is absolutely fabulous. It was longlisted for the Academy Awards. But when you read its synopsis, you might get a little concerned. You have to give it space, because it follows a young boy whose father goes out and tries to hunt. It's the word used, and it is hunting people trying to cross into Canada through unregistered border crossings, right? I don't like to say illegally, because there's nuance
exist.
There.
Yeah, illegal immigration doesn't even exist as a technical term in Canada, I think.
Yeah. So at first glance, you're like, oh, I don't want to see that. But it follows this boy and how he, once his eyes are open to it, rebels against it. But you make that comment again, like you could easily demonize the family that he's come from, right? But that isn't all that helpful, right? It ignores the systemic pressures and influence, and that's really what you have to get at the root at, right? Rather than shaming a single individual or even a group of people, like we tend to do sometimes.
And yeah, and that film was actually very personal because I come from a region that's very nationalistic and very not necessarily racist, but there's because like in 2017 when I started writing the script, there were actually militia groups like that were popping up, like far right tendencies that we hadn't seen before. And they would go to the border and, try to intimidate migrants working, not exactly in the way that it's portrayed in my film, but there was stuff like that which didn't exist before, and a lot of people from my hometown would sympathize with them. And I grew up with these people, and I know that most of them are not evil. They're not, they're not monsters, and you can hang out with them. You can, go to have dinner with them. And some of them were my friends, but, there's lack of education, and there's fear, and there's, and systemic pressures and stuff like that. So that was kind of the idea of trying to speak about the place I come from in a way that was not judgmental, but that didn't excuse either, because obviously I don't agree with the characters in my film. But the boy was kind of me realizing that, I come from this is where I come from. Actually, this is my hometown. That's what they believed in, and having this kind of moment of realization that I don't agree with where I'm from. So where do I belong with? That was very personal in a way to me. Kind of a coming of age of my own realization that I'm left wing, basically.
No. Safe space.
One thing I'm always curious about is, speaking of that story is, when people are from areas that are not reflective of who they are today, like how did you get there, I guess? Like why would you say that you ended up left wing? And
well, I think I had left wing parents for sure within that environment. Like my extended family and my friends and my neighbors were more right-wing than my household for sure. But then it's moving out of, moving to the city, of course, moving to Montreal and studying and getting a higher education and reading about stuff and meeting people that changes your perspective. But my household was not racist at all. Like we were very... So I had these values embedded in me, but I didn't... the people around me were not necessarily agreeing with those values, let's say.
Hearing you speak, like one of the things you said before we started recording just isn't sitting well with me. You said you weren't an activist. But I disagree. Like from the stance, like you're not carrying a placard or perhaps lobbying a politician. It's clear what you're trying to do. At least to me, it comes across as simply retelling that story of transformation. Yours might not have been of transformation, but that is activism.
Perhaps it is, but the whole rationale behind me saying that is because I used to be an actual activist when I was like in my university years, and I was arrested a few times and beaten by cops, and that's when I realized like I need to stop doing this, and that's when I shifted my attention to movie making instead. And so I still do activism through my films, but
yes,
I'm kind of a coward, so
no.
So I hide behind films.
Okay, I'm going to unpack that a little bit because I've got a lot of people listening who have niches, right? Things that they're really good at, but maybe don't fall under typical activism. And I like that we've interviewed a few people now that like use photography or filmmaking now and other database entry. Like sometimes it's really... like I said, niche skills, but it's the purpose behind them that I believe makes you an activist. And it absolutely takes more than folks getting charged and arrested, even though that was our last episode. I was talking to people and about that process, but I want to just remind people over and over again, it absolutely takes all kinds, every facet, and art has always played a massive role in shaping narratives, reshaping narratives, and creating a healthier social fabric. So there's all ways that people can interject with these oppressive systems and help tear them down in their own way. I believe
Yeah.
that's
Thank you
what you're
for making me not feel so guilty about not attending protests anymore. But actually, yeah, it was kind of my thinking also, because I've seen that, like, the impact that a film can have on an audience. And, I showed my film back in my hometown and in those regions where I would have never thought that the reaction would have been so positive. Actually, like, I'm talking about Richelieu, the last feature, not the short film, but the feature that I did. It felt like people were really, really listening. Even, we've showed the film in historically very conservative regions of Quebec, and people were, of course, some might disagree, but in general, people were actually very open-minded. And it just so happens that in the past 3 years, especially during the COVID lockdown, when there were, stories of migrants, dying because of being all lodged in very tight spaces and stuff like that, people have heard about the issue, and it feels like now they're much more ready to hear about it. And in Quebec, there's also like that extra complexity, because, like, we feel as a nation, the Quebecois, that we were colonized also, and that we have suffered also as victims. So to tell them that perhaps you've been victim in the past, but right now you're being the oppressor, it's actually very, very painful for people to hear, and sometimes they react very strongly against that. And I was expecting that sort of reaction from the Quebec crowd, and that's not what happened at all. People were really, really ready to hear that message that, yeah, perhaps this is wrong, and we need to do better. And that's something I've noticed, that, like, my film was able to bring that dialogue in some very conservative places that I would never have anticipated.
I gotta say, I would definitely obviously consider myself an activist, but part of the reason that I got to where I am, when I look back, there was a documentary that I watched back in grade 9 of high school, and I don't remember the name, but it was about banana republics. It was about, United Fruit Company and what the atrocities that they committed in countries like my home country of Colombia, right? And
Guatemala.
and Guatemala, and absolutely, and that, I remember that being a moment in time that changed something for me. Like, I was always very socially minded, but something about that sent me down a rabbit hole that was part of what got me to where I am today and the person that I am today. And so I can absolutely, like, just from firsthand experience, like, the power that these films can have. So, I part of the goal of this podcast is to help create more activists, and I think that films like yours is they carry the same goal, and so I definitely no gatekeeping of the term here, because I don't know
I
if
totally
I would be where I
relate.
am.
Also, like, I've seen films, especially when I was studying, that, it kind of made sense that, okay, I can do activism that way. And as much as I'm into the politics of everything, I'm also about the art form and the storytelling. I want to make good films that anyone can go watch, sit in a theater, and even if they're not tuned to the political message, they can enjoy, or have an interesting experience as it is. So I think filmmaking has that power to kind of reach a wider audience, because if you trick them in with good storytelling, and then you end up telling stuff that they wouldn't want to hear in other circumstances, then maybe that's the way to engage a dialogue. That's my thinking.
And that brings me to the Mayworks Festival. You'll be not debuting, but
almost debuting. Like in Toronto, it's going to be only the second time it's ever been screened to a live audience in Toronto. It's played everywhere in Canada, except for some reason in Toronto, it's only played once. So,
what the? Well, you're going to fix that. But the May Works Festival, obviously, due to its name, it starts on May 1st. It runs the whole month of May. And it's not just film, right? So to speak to what you two were just talking about, they use wide a range of mediums to draw in as much people as possible. And all of it's centered on like working class issues, things like inaccessible health care in Ontario, the plight of injured workers, housing issues, land grabs in Pakistan, and a few different analysis of resistance movements, which is clearly a theme in your film as well, you know, resisting and rejecting the systems around us. And so we'll link folks to that festival for sure so they can check out. All of it is free, but participating in something like this is a great venue for an audience that might already be receptive. But I think like your refusal to not to demonize the traditional villains in the story and to really focus on the system, I think is what makes it more receptive to like the conservative crowds that you were talking about in Quebec. Did you air it in your hometown in Richelieu?
In the region, yeah, in the like the biggest city in the region, it actually came out in commercial theater there, and it did pretty well, much to my surprise. But yeah, because the film is not pointing fingers to anyone, like people felt ready to like just hear the message, I think, and that made a difference for sure.
Why are most of your films focused on empathizing with migrants?
I don't know.
You do.
I don't know. Perhaps because it's a pressing issue right now. I think my generation in general is much more sensitive to that. Like if I compare like to my parents' generation, you know, and especially in Quebec in the 80s and 90s, it was not about immigration. You know, kind of the priorities have shifted a little bit. But I don't know. I think, you know, it probably, you know, you make films about the stuff that keeps you up at night. Because if you're going to be working for 10 years on a single issue, it's got to be something that really moves you somehow. So I don't know, maybe a psychanalyst could tell me better why it feels so important to me. But it's something that I read about every day. And so you end up making films about, you know, the stuff that you feel... is relevant and important and urgent to speak about.
Well, we know that feeling. We know that feeling for sure. Sometimes there's just too much to get upset about. And I appreciate that you're able to focus on something. I mean, I'm glad you're drawing light onto this specifically in Quebec as well, because I think that's a real huge wedge issue that's easy exploitable to the masses. And, you know, it really distracts, right? It allows en masse for people to demonize folks that are just being so heavily exploited. So telling that side of the story in an entertain, because not everyone will watch a documentary either, right? Like some people feel like they're being spoon-fed something and they know it. It's like, you know, the kid knows you've got vegetables on that spoon. But, you know, watching your trailer, especially, it's very... you get excited. I suggest folks get out to see this film. You've talked about the response from migrant workers and the organizations that are organizing in Quebec. I read something that was kind of dismaying, and I wondered if you could shed light on it or whatnot. But Guillermo Candiz works with migrants in Quebec, and he made the statement that Quebec has a lot fewer organizations and networks to help these workers than we have in Ontario. And I know we've got quite a few in Ontario, but I wouldn't say that like everyone is got ample resources. So how few resources are there for migrant workers in Quebec, and why? Why is there such a lack of network there?
I couldn't know really. I couldn't compare with what it is in Ontario. I know there is one very important organization in Quebec, which is called RATMAC. that was founded like in 2016, so not that long ago, but they've been doing a lot, and we've worked a lot with them in order to organize screenings for migrant workers to actually watch the film and know, because the film works as a way to open eyes of the Canadian population, but it can also work as a cautionary tale for Guatemalan workers to come when they come in Canada and knowing what to expect, And so Ratmac exists and has been doing a really good job. And I know there's tons of smaller local organizations. I know because they ask us all the time to screen the film, but I can't compare to what it is in Ontario and how they're better suited or better funded or not. I really couldn't know. But there are organizations to support migrant workers there, and there are more and more, especially post-COVID. A lot of people are because it's such a pressing issue, and now the media is talking about it on a regular basis. People are much more aware than they used to. So things are, if there's a glimmer of hope there, that people are hearing the message, and that hopefully things will start to change for real.
One of the things that we've heard many times on this show is the need for people to witness victories and to see successes before they can really commit their energy to forming a resistance. And so although you called it a cautionary tale for migrant workers, it also can be a kind of call to arms, not literally, but when you see that it is possible, that, you are inspired by, and especially when they know they're watching, although they're watching a film, they know they're not watching fiction, right? Because they live and breathe this. So it has that impact as well. And I hope it also has the impact of, Canadians watching the protagonists and understanding their role within the system and the choices that they can make. You could either be the supervisor or you could be the translator, right?
Exactly.
You have a choice there.
Exactly.
So in the end,
but
although
making that sacrifice, it's a big jump, from being a sympathizer to actually going to a place where you're willing to sacrifice your own comfort, there's a gap. And I understand that some people, won't go that far. But ever since the film has come out, I got actually a lot of letters from translators working in similar situation, telling me either that they've lost their jobs or that they've acted in the past, or that they're thinking about leaving their jobs for those reasons. And so I know that character as like an anchor in reality, because people related also to that character, that character in industries that are similar to what's depicted in the film. So yeah, hopefully it sparks the will of some people to make that final step and not necessarily sacrifice their own jobs, but willing to disobey and resist in some shape or form.
What are you working on now?
I've just finished a short film on slaughterhouses, so about animal cruelty, also very very tough subject.
The food processing industry is not going to like you, my friend.
No, I'm not making any friends there, that's for sure. And then my second feature, I'm almost done writing it. It's about police brutality, but towards the LGBTQ community. So another very tough subject.
I saw Santiago's head whip around when you talked about your next feature. So please keep us up to date on that. We will keep our eyes out for that. And again, like I said, we'll link people back to the Mayworks Festival that starts pretty soon.
Yeah. By the way, please come see the film. It's screened on May 1st in this town hall. I'll be there. There's going to be a discussion afterward. It's free. What you really have to do on I think it's a Wednesday night or Tuesday night, not even sure, but come check it out. It's free.
And it's May Day, right? Perfect way to celebrate May Day with a film at a festival that's geared towards working class struggle.
Yeah, exactly. That's gonna make you very angry and gonna make you want to fight afterward, hopefully.
Oh, I think it will. I mean, and that's our crowd. That's who you're speaking to in our audience, right? So that's perfect. Is there anything you want to share that we didn't draw out of you?
I don't think so. I think we went around. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, really.
Oh, no, yeah, the pleasure was all ours. We very much appreciate you taking the time, I mean, 10 years, to tell these stories and to do activism your way.
Thank you so much, guys.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.